Hi, get cozy again. It's time for another brainy bedtime story time with your bedtime story reader, me, Lynn. So, we've been reading the book, I should say, Hero on a Mission by Donald Miller. And now we're ready for chapter 2. A hero accepts their own agency. For an unfortunate number of years, I ignored the idea that my life could be better. I rejected the idea I needed to create structure and a rhythm, and ignoring those ideas cost me a great deal. I'd say ignoring the fact that I needed to take control of my own life cost me an entire decade of personal progress. Ooh, that's really bad. If I could go back, I'd take my life more seriously. I'd live with some discipline. Back then, though, I was entirely controlled by moods. I remember a certain chair at Common Grounds Coffee House on Hawthorne. I wrote a good page that morning and came to believe the good words would only come if I were sitting in that chair. For the better half of a month, I'd show up in the morning, and if somebody was sitting in that chair, I would go next door and eat breakfast tacos at the table by the window until whoever had been sitting in that chair had left the coffee shop. I know all this sounds like the writer's life, but career writers don't live that way. Stephen King, Annie Dillard, James Patterson, they treat writing as a discipline. They clock in like blue collar workers and they build their books brick by brick. All my wandering around searching for a mood was a victim mindset. Victims live at the mercy of forces outside of themselves. Heroes are not as strong as you think. They are usually unwilling to act, in need of help, filled with self doubt, and often incompetent in the very area in which they are given their challenge. The journey, of course, changes them. Still, the hero must participate. They must decide to take the journey. Bilbo leaves the Shire. Ulysses sets sail. Romeo scales the wall into Juliet's courtyard. At some point in a story, the characters divide, and it becomes obvious who will be the victim, who will be the guide, who will be the hero, and who will be the villain. I've never been able to accurately put words to it, but during the season of frustration with my roommates, a seed had been planted. I needed to change. I needed to take my life seriously and practice some discipline. The heroic transformation begins when the hero takes responsibility for their life and for their story. The hero becomes the hero only when they can decide to accept the facts of their life and respond with courage. I understand the fear of trying, though. As I said, I was reluctant to embrace structure. Thinking of myself as a victim offered me one thing that a heroic mindset could not provide: an excuse. I think that's the big reason for the lack of transformation in the life of a victim. When we think of ourselves as a victim, we get to stop trying because we believe we are helpless. When I talk about the victim mindset, again, I'm not talking about actual victims who really are hopeless and need to be rescued. But I wonder if people pray for rescue sometimes and then resent God for not helping them, only to realize in time that God did not rescue them because they did not need to be rescued. They were not actually victims. Psychologists have a name for the act of surrendering power to outside forces. It's called an external locus of control. It means the person surrendering power believes that external outside forces are in charge. An internal locus of control, on the other hand, means we believe that to a large degree we are actually in control of our destinies. This is an important transition for us all to make. Psychologists have associated an external locus of control, that is, we think our problem is because of our circumstances and all the stuff outside. It's associated with higher levels of depression, lower wages, and troubled relationships. An internal locus of control has been shown to correlate with a stronger sense of belonging, less depression, higher wages, and more fulfilling relationships. These correlations make sense. A person who does not believe they can control their life is a backseat driver in their own skin. They're sliding around as blind fate swerves them off the road. They do not realize they are actually in the driver's seat and they can steer their life toward preferred outcomes. But how much of our lives can we actually control? The truth is, of course, we cannot control every aspect of our lives. I do not get to control the weather. I do not get to control other people. I don't get to control where I was born, my height, and so on. But some people mistakenly believe that because they cannot control some characteristics of their lives, they cannot control their lives at all. Corporations, politicians, and even some religious leaders often take advantage of such people. Manipulative leaders try to convince you that your problems are not your fault, and if you just trust in them or their ideology, you'll be okay. Social scientists use another term to explain the dynamic of personal control and power: agency. Agency refers to the ability we have to make our own choices, and all of us have agency. Agency can be unfairly limited by factors such as social class, religion, and ability, but agency is almost never completely limited. In fact, very happy people know a secret. A human being has a ridiculous amount of personal agency. A person's reaction to a set of circumstances dramatically affects how their story plays out. Looking back on my own life, I think I know exactly where I forfeited my own agency. I had given it up as a kid. My father left when I was 2. My mother went back to work. She left early in the morning for work. So my sister and I walked to school, often in clothes that my mother had sewn because we couldn't afford new clothes. I found comfort in food, and I would eat anything sugary. I started gaining weight, and without question, I was the heaviest kid in school. And this, of course, led to me being bullied on the playground. When you're bullied, you have 2 choices: fight back or lie down and play dead. I lay down and played dead, and to a great degree, it worked. If I was helpless, nobody bothered me. I learned to stay helpless, and worse, I believed the lie that I was helpless. When I lament about my life is how long it took me to accept agency. If I had the knowledge to make that transition earlier, many years would have been redeemed. I'd have had a lot more fun in my teens and 20s if I had risen up. In fact, growing up poor, walking to school, and feeling a little neglected didn't have to be such a bad thing. I wish I would have been as proud of my upbringing then as I am today. My mother worked hard. She loved us enough to sew our clothes. We had it tough, but when you have it tough, you learn to get tough if you are willing. It just took me a lot longer to be willing. I'm going to skip around a little bit here. Okay, interesting. Okay, but what if we really are victims? Well, my favorite philosopher, Viktor Frankl, is a terrific example of a real victim who, through sheer strength of will, summoned heroic energy to transform himself. In the 1930s, his therapy, called logotherapy, began to invite people who saw themselves as victims into a life of meaning. Logotherapy translates into a therapy of meaning. Frankl used it to treat patients who were suicidal, and the treatment worked. Many of his patients experienced a positive transformation as they began to work on projects, join communities, and reframe their pain to see it as a benefit. Frankl's theory about life having meaning, even in the midst of extreme pain and suffering, was tested and proven. He had been working hard on a manuscript explaining his theory when the Nazis invaded Vienna in 1938. As a Jew, he was taken captive. Before he was taken, though, his wife Tilly sewed his manuscript into the lining of his coat so he could continue his work. One day, in the concentration camp, his coat and manuscript were taken, and his work was lost. The Nazis then separated the psychologist from Tilly, who was pregnant with their first child. She was then murdered in the camps. Oh my gosh, that's sad, along with his unborn child. Frankl would soon learn that his mother and father had been murdered too. He was understandingly despondent and near suicide himself. Instead of taking his life, though, he realized his life could still have a purpose. He accepted agency over what he could still control, and somehow, even in the camps, began rewriting the manuscript in his mind. Even amidst the forced labor and death that surrounded him, he continued his work, not allowing his captors to take what remained of his agency. In the camps, friends would come to him and challenge his notion that their lives had meaning even when they were treated like animals. Our stories will be told, and when they are told, Frankl explained, the world will know that there is an evil which must be protected against. Even if they kill us, our lives serve a purpose. Our lives have meaning. After miraculously surviving the camps, Viktor Frankl would go on to lecture about how life offered a deep sense of meaning to any person who accepted the challenge. He encouraged audiences who felt a personal despair amidst hardships to reframe their own story. He encouraged the world to understand that in all of its light and dark, life was still beautiful, and we could contribute to the growth of that beauty. He would rewrite his manuscript and publish the book. Man's Search for Meaning, Frankl's seminal work, would go on to sell more than 16 million copies. Yes, I do have a copy of that book too. Paramount to Frankl's idea is personal agency. He argued it is our choice to believe that life has meaning, and we choose to experience that meaning if we structure our lives to serve a greater purpose. No other thinker has helped me understand what I experienced in the transition from victim to hero more than Mr. Viktor Frankl. If Viktor Frankl did not see himself as a victim, I have no excuse. None of us do. We can reframe our story and structure our lives in such a way as to experience a deep and fulfilling sense of meaning. After realizing what the victim mindset had cost me, I began writing with a greater purpose. I decided to dedicate the morning to write regardless of my mood. When writing my first book, I believed it would be a bestseller. The book sold about 37 copies, and my mother bought 20 of them. It was a failure. But if a hero does not experience setbacks, the story gets dull. Setbacks and challenges are the only elements in a story that change us. But I didn't know any of that back then. I just thought I'd failed and I got mad about it. The failure of that book launched another season of temptation. The shiny victim bait dangled in front of me. I had been wrong about my own talent. I worked for a year preparing a letter to the world that nobody wanted to read. And so here was another point in my story where the characters divide. It was as though I could see the paths before me. I could choose to play the victim or the hero. I decided to take the better path. I started looking at the bright side. Writing a book nobody had heard of made me an exceptional conversationalist at dinner parties. That's a good way to think of it. So you wrote a book? Can I find it at a bookstore? It's not on the shelf, but if you ask the guy behind the counter, he can order it, and you can borrow it from the library. But I don't get paid for that. I kept writing. The next book sold well. I was still very overweight, though. I wore large sweaters, even when it was warm. But somehow that made me come off as the underdog, and readers liked that. At book readings, people looked at me with hope, as though the part of them that binges ice cream while watching television could someday write a book too. I kept trying. I lost some weight, I got a girlfriend, and when that didn't work, I got another one. And then I began structuring my life with a little more discipline. Thanks to Frankel, plus a couple other writers, I realized what I had been searching for. I had been searching for meaning. I lost my victim mindset just like I lost the weight, slowly, inconsistently, and often with setbacks. Still, if you want to lose 12 pounds in a year and you only gain back 4 the following year, I can help. All you have to do is worry a lot. It takes a long time, but until you shed the weight, you can wear a large sweater. Meaning is the same. You accept your own agency. You move your locus of control from outside yourself to inside yourself. You go on intentional adventures. You get to experience meaning. You wake up each day and you push the plot forward. The more I lived intentionally and the more focused my life plan and daily structure became, the more I transformed. In the challenge of writing another book, I felt meaning. In the fear of talking to a girl at church, I felt meaning. In buying a puppy, in climbing a mountain, in learning to kayak, there is meaning. I began to realize that life and writing stories had some of the same rules. If the characters do not want something, they do not face their challenges, and they do not try hard and grow, the story does not work. If we don't want something, if we don't try hard things, our life stories will not work either. I didn't fully know what those rules were just yet. I was just figuring them out at the time, but I did realize I had a great deal of control over my life, especially over my attitude. Later that year, a friend's friend asked if we could get together to talk about writing. He was a young, unpublished writer who had read one of my books and wanted to know how publishing worked. So we sat and talked for a while, but he rejected the idea that life had meaning. At one point, I interrupted him. Well, what if life is not meaningless? What do you mean? He asked. Well, I said, what if life has meaning and you just have to live a certain way in order to experience that meaning? What if dialectical reasoning won't get you the answer? Explain, he said. I should not have worded my response this way, but I said, what if life itself is not meaningless? What if just your life is meaningless? We did not become friends after that, but I still think it's a valid observation. What if life is like a story, and you and I are the theater of our own minds, looking out at the camera of our eyes, and the story unfolding feels either meaningless or meaningful? And what if we trust fate to write our stories, it feels meaningless, but if we accept our own agency and structure our lives a certain way, our lives become charged with meaning. I don't think my answer was good enough for my friend's friend. I think he wanted proof that life had meaning before he was willing to experience that meaning. But to me, the whole idea that meaning can be experienced but not proved was making more and more sense to me. I could not explain why I was beginning to feel a greater sense of purpose or was more interested in stepping into my shoes every morning. I just knew that meaning was happening. The term I now use to describe the restlessness of sitting in the theater of our minds, waiting for something to happen, is narrative void. No longer being interested in your own story, mainly because the story isn't interesting. That's how many people live, and it's sad. I totally agree. This is what I had begun to understand, and I have come to believe it more every day for the past 20 years. My life is no less difficult than anybody else's, and I'm not always happy. But in answer to the question of whether my life has meaning, I would say yes, it does. Many stories don't work out. Every good writer has thousands of pages they toss into the trash, but it's the same in life. Not every day works out. But many of the stories I tried to live, work terrifically, and I'm glad of that. Betty and the Coming Baby, this book, my company, our home. I'm not the same man I used to be because the stories I've chosen to live have transformed me into somebody else. In stories, characters who try hard things transform. They have to. The person they were is not enough to overcome their challenges. They have to get stronger, humbler, more tender, smarter. They have to change in order to get over the wall. And in the growing pains that come with transformation, there is the experience of meaning. I can't prove it, but back then I began to feel it, and I feel it today. When we live as victims, we do not experience a deep sense of meaning. But when we live as characters, acting on an important mission, we do. So, how can we accept our own agency and live in such a way that we experience meaning? I'll tackle that in the next chapter. Alright, and we will too. So, next time in chapter 3 of Hero on a Mission. Thanks for reading with me today. I hope you have a wonderful night and that you'll be thinking about your own personal mission and life story. Good night. Till next time. Bye bye.